Most of the people who moved to the right in Israel did so because of what Masua said, the fear. They feared that, look, if a Palestinian state looked like Costa Rica, every Israeli would sign up for it. Maybe except for that ideological right, but it's a minority. They just want to know one thing. If they withdraw, are they more secure? Or are they more vulnerable? And if diplomats cannot give an answer to that, then you lose Israel. And frankly, we won't have the support. And by the way, on the Palestinian side, if there's settlements that are unbridled, we won't have Palestinians either.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Jonathan Saman Hot Buttons Cool Conversations discussion series. I'm Lily Rabinoff-Goldman, President and CEO of JCC Greater Boston. In these complicated and difficult times, we are so happy you are all joining us for our speaker series, Jonathan Saman Hot Buttons Cool Conversations. This series invites distinguished public figures to engage in conversation on thought-provoking and at times divisive subjects. Our panelists are led by expert moderators through respectful and timely discussions on issues of concern to the Jewish community and beyond. Tonight's program, Israel and Gaza, Finding a Way Forward, is especially meaningful as it is personal for so many of us, and we know that it resonates because so many of you are joining us tonight. We're thrilled you're here. It has been nearly 6 months since the attacks on October 7th, and there seems to be no end in sight for the conflict in Gaza. With an incalculable human cost, our Hot Buttons Cool Conversations panel examines if there's another way forward. We look ahead to the time when Israelis, Palestinians, and the rest of the world must wrestle with the future of Gaza and its relationship with Israel. We will examine Israel's alternative paths and what role the U.S. should play in managing the crisis. On our distinguished panel tonight, we are honored to have the following experts. Joyce Karam is Senior News Editor at Al Monitor and an adjunct professor at George Washington University. She has covered American politics and the Middle East for over 2 decades and previously worked in Lebanon. She is also the author of the China Middle East Weekly newsletter. David Makovsky is the Ziegler Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute and director of the Koret Project on Arab-Israel Relations. He is an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University's Paul H. Nitze School of Advanced International Studies. He previously worked in the office of the U.S. Secretary of State, serving as a senior advisor to the Special Envoy for Israel-Palestinian negotiations. Masua Sagiv is scholar in residence of the Shalom Hartman Institute and the Koret visiting assistant professor of Jewish and Israel Studies at the Helen Diller Institute, UC Berkeley. Masua's work focuses on the development of contemporary Judaism in Israel as a culture, religion, nationality, and as part of Israel's identity as a Jewish and democratic state. Khalil Sayegh is a political analyst focused on Palestinian politics and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He is the co-founder and president of the Agora Initiative. Khalil lived most of his life in Gaza and the West Bank, where he was involved in political activism and humanitarian initiatives. Thank you to all of you. Thank you to all of you so much for joining us. Our moderator tonight, Aaron David Miller, is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, focusing on U.S. foreign policy. He has written 5 books, including The Much Too Promised Land, America's Elusive Search for Arab-Israeli Peace. He previously served at the State Department, where he helped formulate U.S. policy on the Middle East and the Arab-Israel peace process. We're sure to have an amazing discussion. I'm really excited. As we begin our program, we'd like to thank our donors. Without your financial support, we would not be able to produce tonight's program. We appreciate your commitment to fulfilling the mission of both Hot Buttons Cool Conversations and the JCC. Creating space for respectful dialogue around challenging and timely issues is at the heart of our Hot Buttons program, and that is especially true for us tonight. Tonight's program is being recorded and produced in partnership with WGBH. Our panel will be taking questions from our audience members toward the end of the program. If you would like to ask a question to our panelists, please send it through the Q&A function in the Zoom chat, and we will get through as many questions as time allows. Now, let's turn things over to our moderator. Aaron, thank you.
Lily, thanks so much. It's great to be here with Khalil, Masua, Joyce, and with David. A note on housekeeping. We're going to have two rounds of questions. The first is going to concentrate primarily on the ongoing conflict, and the second on the much more difficult prospect of the proverbial day after, and the future trajectory of what's set into motion now. But before we do, I want to make two observations, both cut to the core of what I think is extremely important in trying to analyze this conflict, and that is humility. I've given scores of interviews since October 7th, and the one question I'm asked most frequently is, why can't any external actor or actors intercede to stop this? We're 6 months into a war seemingly without end. The question still surprises me because it fundamentally points up an objective reality which is stunningly obvious and very difficult to ignore. And that is this: from October 7th until today, this conflict has been shaped, driven by the objectives, the motives, the tactics, and the strategies of two combatants. The Middle East, based on my 27 years at the Department of State and another 27 or so analyzing this region, is literally littered with the remains of great powers who wrongly believe they could impose their will on small tribes. And the reality is, in a conflict in which both parties have elevated the frame to the level of the existential, it's extremely difficult. That's why we're 6 months into this conflict, for outside parties to fundamentally alter the trajectory, to do it easily or frankly at all, of the two major combatants. Second observation is a tad more hopeful. It's a personal observation, but to me it's important, and I'll share it with you. On October 6, 1973, I was in Jerusalem, coming out of Yom Kippur services, when I heard the sirens wail. And for the next 3 weeks, I watched a society and a nation traumatized. 2,800 dead, the greatest intelligence failure until now. Countless numbers of Egyptians and Syrians killed. And yet within 6 years, I watched on the White House lawn Begin, Sadat, and Carter sign an Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. In that case, trauma turned to hope. 20 years later, September 13th, 1993, I sat on the White House lawn watching Clinton, Arafat, and Rabin sign what I was persuaded would be the beginning of the end of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In that case, hope turned to trauma. So what do you take away from this? My takeaway is very simple. We cannot divine the future. We do not know what is in front of us. History and the historical arc moves in ways that sometimes we cannot divine. And I would make this personal observation for myself. All we can do at this moment is try to do everything we possibly can to try to bend the arc of history in the right direction. So let me begin our discussion, our dialogue with Khalil. Khalil, welcome. We'll start with the Palestinian dimension to the conflict on October 7th. As you analyze 6 months in, how would you characterize Hamas's motivations for the October 7 attack? What did they hope to achieve? And what have they achieved?
Thanks, Adam, for having me. To start with want to say with certainty that we know what Hamas motivation was, I think will be completely wrong, because we really don't know what's the actual motivation was. However, we can draw some analysis and assumptions based on a lot of statements that they have making since the beginning, and beside the statements, the different statements that their leaders have made. And one can say that between the statements of the leadership and the political level, and also on the armed level, the military wing, you can see some conflicting of statements on what they really were trying to achieve, what they were really up to, and I can go through all of that. But to give the context from the statement of Hamas and from a Palestinian perspective generally, even those who are not in Hamas share this opinion that October 7 was not unprovoked, that October 7 did not just came out of nowhere. October 7 came out of years and years of repression, of occupation, and continuation of the suppression of the Palestinian people. The statement that Hamas has published, and also the different factions within the Palestinian society, all agree that this is a response to more than 230 Palestinians that were killed in the West Bank, to the continuation of violation of status quo in Jerusalem and Al-Aqsa Mosque, etc. So from a Palestinian perspective generally, and Hamas, they see it as just a continuation of anti-occupation, anti-colonial struggle toward the liberation of Palestine. However, when we talk about Hamas itself, Hamas has its own political calculation, obviously, for what it's trying to achieve, what it's trying to get. On the domestic front, I do think that Hamas was thinking that they're going to have this big scale operation, that this will bring about some sort of it will bring obviously some sort of fracture to Gaza. It will be a big war, but then they will be able to make a deal with Israel. They will seize the siege that is on Gaza. Some of them were thinking in these terms. Others were thinking in terms of that this would lead to some sort of revolution or a new intifada in the West Bank, and this will cause the collapse of the Palestinian Authority. And what will emerge out of that is that Israel and others will be convinced to work with Hamas to establish another sort of Gaza situation in the West Bank. Many leaders within Hamas think that. However, there's also another opinion, and that's the opinion I think that is more prominent on the military wing of Hamas. I mean, if you listen to Mohammed Deif, who is the head of the military wing in Hamas, in his statement that was published on October 7th, he seems to be convinced that this is sort of the battle of the end. He was convinced that this might be the battle of sort of liberation of Palestine. If you listen carefully in Arabic, he speaks of that we will flood Israel with soldiers, we will fight. He would call on Lebanon and Hezbollah militants to intervene. He calls on the Palestinians in the West Bank to start shooting. He calls on the Palestinian security forces themselves to stop coordination with Israel, to start using their guns, attacking the Israelis. He calls on people, even a Palestinian citizen of Israel, carry any weapon you have, carry any knife, and start attacking Israelis. And his thinking and what he seems to believe in his statement, that this could lead to some sort of creation of a Palestinian state or liberation. It's not very clear what he means, if it's like a liberation in the sense of two-state solution or in the liberation in the sense of the dismantle of Israel. It's not very clear, but that's an opinion that the military wing of Hamas has sort of carried. What has Hamas achieved from all of that? I think nothing. I think Hamas seems to have miscalculated. I think the thinking among Hamas's leaders, such as Yahya Sinwar, was that if we have enough people kidnapped, Israel wouldn't retaliate in this size. There wouldn't be that attack because they're worried about their hostages' life. And then we can have a deal, and boom, Hamas's popularity goes up, and Hamas sort of becomes the address to anyone who wants to talk to the Palestinians. This wasn't fulfilled. I think the only thing that Hamas was able to sort of fulfill, hypothetically for them, is that there has been an increase in support for Hamas, especially in the West Bank, as opposed to Gaza is more complicated. But not only in the West Bank, I think more broader than that, in the Arab world, Hamas was able to capture the imagination of young Arabs from Amman to Cairo to other Arab states as well.
The nature of the attacks, the indiscriminate nature of the killing and the taking of hostages, how did that as a tactic factor into the objectives? I mean, you seem to suggest that, in fact, there may have been no overriding strategy and maybe a miscalculation, but the taking of hostages and the indiscriminate nature of the killing, how was that rationalized as a tactic to achieve a goal? Was there a goal?
Yeah, I think the goal was to create as much terror and fear in the Israeli psyche. It was meant to do that. I mean, however, one has to say that at least Hamas claimed that the targeting of the civilians was not their target. I mean, they say that we were trying to target only military outposts, and that the civilian casualties are sort of collateral damage. Others would say that some of them have guns and we had to deal with them, etc. However, if you listen to the actual statement from the military leader, Mohammed Deif, his statements were very clear that you could kill the others, except he says in his statement, children and elderly. Although we've seen even some casualties among children and elders, but his statement in Arabic was very clear that he should not kill those. But that seems a permission to kill those who are not children or elderly, who are non-combatant or civilian, and it is obviously morally not acceptable and legally. But that was the mission of terrorism, etc. The second thing too, that there is a very high probability. I mean, it's not even probability anymore, but it's very likely that after the first few hours of the attack, Hamas lost control on what was happening inside. I mean, they lost control over some of their militants. For example, we know that the Shati politician of Hamas were commanded to reach a certain point, and then they kidnapped people, they attacked, and then they went back, and some of the members went back to Gaza, and then they were very convinced that they can reach Ashkelon. Then they were targeted before reaching Ashkelon. So in this sense, they lost control. On the other hand, a lot of other factions got involved there, and there is chances that even radical Salafist group, who are very, very small minority in Gaza, were involved. Families, clans, and even just different gangs and people who are not affiliated nationally were also involved and committed probably atrocities as well.
Many questions. I have one more, and if you could just briefly, it's hard to answer, I know. The relationship, in your judgment, between the internal leadership, Yahya Sinwar, his brother Mohammed, Marwan Issa, who the Israelis claim to have killed, and Mohammed Deif, the relationship between the military leaders, the architects, the implementors, and the external leadership, in your view?
Yeah, I mean, sure. Hamas would say
making key decisions in the negotiations that have been off and on now for several weeks.
Sure. Hamas would say usually that its military wing is just submissive to the political leadership. That's what they claim. That's what they would say all the time. However, one looking at the situation in Gaza really carefully knows that the military wings does have opinions that disagree sometimes with political leadership in Qatar, etc. Right now, it seems very clear that the two people who have the most input into the decision among Hamas is Yahya Sinwar and Mohammed Deif. I mean, obviously Mohammed Deif on the military wing. Yahya Sinwar, despite him being on the political leadership of Hamas in Gaza, he was involved with. His start was with Kataib al-Qassam on the military wing, and his relationship is quite strong. So I would say that the ones that have the most say in it is the military wing in Gaza, and especially Mohammed Deif and Yahya Sinwar. And if one looks at the 2014 war and the negotiation and the way it played out there, would see clearly the conflicting of statements between the military wing and the negotiation team in Cairo, and how the military wing was pushing a different policy than ones in Cairo at the time.
Thanks, Khalil. So let's move on to you. First, Israel's reaction as a general proposition, the public's reaction, the mood in Israel to October 7th and what occurred.
Thanks, Aaron, and thank you for inviting me to be here. I think that it's important to understand that Israel is entering October 7th highly unstable. So on October 6th, Israel is on the verge of a civil war, actually, because of social unrest and protests against the judicial overhaul. So even with rifts in society between religious and secular and conservative and liberal, so even the day before October 7th, Israel is extremely unstable. And then October 7th happens. And I would say that there is the joining of three things make October 7th really the worst day, the most horrible day in Israeli history. The first is the scale, 1,200 people murdered in one day, women, children, the elderly, without discrimination, as you said before. Number two is the really unimaginable cruelty. Without getting into too much details, there are plenty of videos and pictures that show that this was systematic, premeditated. There was intent to destroy, if to borrow from the legal definition of the Genocide Convention. It's not just quote unquote, it wasn't just quote unquote killing. You can hear from testimonies from the morgue, the temporary morgue that arrived, that bodies would just come undefined. You cannot identify it. which is part of the trauma. Just to give an example, the systematic sexual violence was not a part of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict until October 7th. So this was something new, and it took Israel by huge surprise. And of course, the hostages, the high number of hostages. So for many people, for I would say the vast majority of Israelis, even though we are 5.5 months after, for many Israelis, October 7th is still ongoing. And number three is, of course, the complete failure of the Israeli military and the Israeli government to protect its people. We specifically, I'm an Israeli, we have friends from the southern of Israel, and they told us, everyone knew that something could happen, but the military would always tell us, you need to hold on for 5 minutes, for 10 minutes, for 15 minutes. And we would see a whole day, 10, 12 hours that people were locked in their safe rooms. And then afterwards, horrifying things that were done to them. So October 7th is, we're 5.5 months left. There is a war going on for 5.5 months with a lot of casualties in Gaza, and still the world, I feel, asks Israel, why are you not moving on? It's important to understand that mentally, Israel is still on October 7th. And maybe I'll just say something about October 7th. I think it's an interesting question to distinguish between whether October 7th is an Israeli event or a Jewish event. And I would say it's both. On the one hand, you see that Hamas terrorists did not distinguish between Israeli Jews and Israeli Arab Palestinians, right? And a lot of Arab Palestinians were also murdered on October 7th. So this is definitely an Israeli event. On the other hand, we also know that this triggered Jewish vulnerability for the Jewish people in general, and not only for Israeli Jews. Maybe I'll stop here.
No, very insightful. I wanted to ask you, just to follow on that, would you agree with the notion, the Israeli ambassador to the United States, Mike Herzog, said it in one of his interviews, other Israelis have said it as well. On October 6th, Israel was one country. On October 7th, Israel was another. And those sorts of transformations are rare. You probably could not make the same judgment on the United States on September 10th. Was the United States one country on September 10 and a different country on September 12? I'm not sure that's inaccurate. We're a big country. But what about Israel? Is it fair, or is that just too much of an exaggeration?
I've been asking myself the same question for a long time, because it seems that on October 7th, or let's say the day after, a lot of people in Israel, if not all of Israelis, would say, our world, if not a lot of Jewish people around the world, will say our world is not the same. Nothing will ever be the same. It's our life before October 7th and after October 7th. And on the other hand, when you try to identify what exactly has changed in Israel, you don't really see what has changed. I mean, I would definitely not, and we'll talk about it later, I assume, I would definitely have not thought that Netanyahu will still be in government 5.5 months after October 7th. We see that, in fact, the politics is the same, the disagreements is the same, the social rifts are the same. If at all, only the fear is much higher. The emotions are all over the place. But the themes, it seems to me that the themes of power and vulnerability and fear and politics and disagreements and what does it mean to be a democracy, what does it mean to be Jewish, it's the same themes. They are much more, the stakes are higher, that's for sure. But it seems to me that the themes are still the same.
If you were a 15-year-old Palestinian or a 15-year-old Israeli living in the Gaza envelope communities, you could argue, though, in terms of transformation, that this is a generation scarring event, perhaps unlike any other Arab-Israeli conflict or even the first and second Intifada. And maybe it's too early to tell. One last question before we move on to Joyce. Maybe we can discuss what Israeli strategic military goals were, but I want to ask you a more specific question. How would you define victory?
So the goals of Israel, when Israel starts or responds starts the war on October 8th or October 9th or the 26th when it enters Gaza, doesn't matter. Two goals to this war. One is bringing back the hostages, and number two is eliminating Hamas control over Gaza so that to make sure that October 7th can never, ever happen again. And by the way, something that has not happened in Israel for the past few decades, to make sure that no missiles are ever rocketed, are ever fired from Gaza to Israel, as we've seen happening for the past 20 years. The problem with these two goals is that you have two approaches in Israel. One approach says that these two goals are dependent on each other and overlap. And therefore, in order to get the hostages out, we need more military pressure and more operations in Gaza. And the other approach says, you know what, these two goals are actually in conflict and they're a zero-sum game. So that if we want the hostages back, we have to pursue a deal, and a deal will not happen with a military pressure. There is a very serious disagreement in Israel right now on whether a victory, if we only get the hostages, but Hamas stays in control, is it a victory or not? And I will just say one thing. There are a lot of people in Israel that are saying that on October 7th, Israel already lost the war and it doesn't matter anymore. There was a war on October 7th and Israel lost. And from that moment on, we can just make things as better as can be. If you're asking me what my personal opinion is, without freeing the hostages, there would be no victory. And it doesn't matter if Hamas is or isn't in control. But I also recognize the genuine fear of Israelis after October 7th. And as Khalid said before, it's important, I think, to listen to statements by Hamas leaders that are saying we're just going to perform October 7th again and again and again if we'll have the opportunity. And Israelis are listening, maybe for the first time in a long time, and are saying, okay, so we need to make sure that that's not going to happen.
Great. Masoud, thanks. Joyce, let's move on. It's a big Arab world, an enormous amount to cover. Just as a general proposition, because I want to ask you two questions. How would you judge the reaction of the Arab world generally in response to October 7 and what followed, Israel's response, the blockade, the airstrikes, and the ground campaign? And who, in your judgment, are the key Arab actors now and moving forward in the war and at some point the post-war environment?
Thanks, Aaron. Great to be with you. Great to be with my colleagues, the panelists. This is very different. October 7th, the Gaza war, many of us have covered, have witnessed wars in the Middle East. This is unlike anything personally I have covered in my 2.5 decades in journalism. As Lily said, this is a little bit personal. This is not just Gaza, not just Israel. This is turning into something that's created a level of polarization, of a divide that we honestly haven't seen around Syria or other wars that are happening in the region. And for those reasons, I think the Arab world, many in the Arab world, woke up on October 7 with a sense of shock, with also a divide. For many of us who follow this conflict, we were still shocked by the events. I remember on that weekend, we at Al Monitor, we had a piece by an expert. We were going to run it on Sunday. And the headline was something around Saudi-Israel normalization, not as far-fetched as experts think. And I'm so glad we had planned it actually for Sunday. Maybe I shouldn't be telling you the story because we ended up, of course, dropping the article. But as Masua has said, so much has changed. So much has changed. The Arab world is not the same before. The conversation has entirely changed from Saudi-Israel normalization to now we're talking, one humanitarian catastrophe, maybe famine in Gaza. Today, a piece in the New York Times around one of the hostages, suffering from sexual assault in Gaza. So this is not an average war in the region, and I think we need to come in terms with the magnitude of this war. As far as the immediate reactions, of course, the more pro-Hamas, pro-resistance camp in the region, there was a sense of euphoria that, finally, Gaza perhaps can break free, as Khalil has mentioned. This is an act of resistance. For others, there were some condemnations, but they were not, outright strong condemnations. I think moderate governments in the region are in a very tough spot because of this war. At the same time, this wasn't entirely surprising that we got to a conflict between Gaza and Israel. We haven't seen any serious peace process now in 8 years or more than 8 years. We have the most far-right government in the history of Israel. So in that sense, a confrontation was expected. Is just the intensity of it, the level of the crimes we're seeing. I think this is where the shock is coming. As far as who is the most influential Arab government, I mean, it depends, right? So you're seeing, I think different governments want to have different role in the conflict or in the day after. For example, for Qatar, Egypt, these are the traditional mediators when it comes to a ceasefire in Gaza. For the United Arab Emirates, maybe they're looking more at aid, at having an inroads to Gaza. I know we'll discuss the day after, so we can talk about that. For Algeria now, that sits on the United Nations Security Council, there is also some chatter if some Hamas leaders, if they leave Qatar or if they leave Gaza, they would go to Algeria. So it really depends on what each stakeholder has in that conflict. Yeah. For others, mainly Iran, I think this conflict is beneficial. It props up the axis of resistance. It shows how much dividends Iran can get from groups like the Houthis or Hezbollah or Iraqi militias without having itself being, dragged into conflict. I don't think Iran necessarily wants a regional war, but it's happy seeing the conversation change in the larger Middle East, and to see its message, this very anti-Israel rhetoric, sometimes anti-Semitic rhetoric take shape.
Geography is destiny, Joyce. My bet is that Egypt's role, which had been eclipsed by Saudi Arabia over the last decade or so, may well actually prove to be, in many respects, the most consequential, given location. David Makovsky, it's really good to see you. Of course, it's good to see everyone. Let me ask you about the Biden administration, Dave. How would you characterize their objectives on October 7? And in your view, how and in what way has the administration's basic objectives and policy responses changed?
Okay, first of all, it's an honor to be with you, Aaron. We've You're an illustrious expert on this for many years. It's an honor to be with you. It's an honor to be with the whole panel. I want to thank the JCC Boston and WGBH Radio for broadcasting this. Look, I would say I think three kind of main objectives on October 7th. One is to get the hostages back. The president has made that clear, how crucial that is to him personally. He's met with the hostage families many times. He's given them like his own personal cell phone number. This is something that I think is very visceral for this president, who very much identifies with Israel in general, is a lifelong Zionist, and and I think for him, this is very personal. And in that regard, I think his trip was also, the first time an American president has gone to Israel during a war. I don't think it's a small matter. So I think for him personally, it's these hostages have to come home, and I stand with Israel after these atrocities. Second, I think the toppling of Hamas from power. It's not about the elimination of Hamas. You can't take Hamas out of the hearts and minds of people. But, he keeps saying what they did is worse than ISIS. The United States went like 7,000 miles into Iraq to go after ISIS. And I think he's made clear we wouldn't live with this as Americans, and we can't expect Israel to live with Hamas. There's no hope for a two-state solution if Hamas remains in power. Their capabilities need to be, diminished. And I have to provide Israel with the wherewithal, the resources, the military assistance, the aircraft of ammunition and the like to make this a reality. And the third thing is avoid a regional war. I think the president's also been very clear about this. What Khalil said before, I think accurately, about how deaf, he really wanted to light up the Middle East on October 7th. He saw this as an axis of resistance. He was lighting the match. And the Hamas people made it very clear that they're very disappointed with the response. I don't think many of us would think that Hassan Nasrallah would have given 6 speeches about why Hezbollah is not joining in this war. Yes, there are border skirmishes, and they've not always remained skirmishes. There's been real damage, real people been killed. And when one goes over that line of the border, the other one responds. But I think there's a sense that neither Israel nor Hezbollah nor the supreme leader won a war. The supreme leader sees Hezbollah as an insurance policy for an Iranian nuclear strike, for an Israeli nuclear strike. It's a deterrent. He doesn't want to see Hezbollah chewed up in a war with Israel. So I think for the president, to make the point is like, I am sending aircraft carriers off the coast in the Eastern Mediterranean. So if any one of you think that you could overwhelm Israel's capabilities, we'll have Iron Dome, I'm here to tell you America's here. So I think the third is no less than the second. And first, stop, I bring the hostages back. And stand with Israel at this time of atrocity, topple Hamas, and avoid a regional war. I think those have been consistent objectives. And I think what's clear is that the president, now, if you look at those objectives, I would argue he's consistent from the beginning of this war till now. What has changed is his critique, Aaron, I think, of the conduct of the war. How is the war being handled? And that is really a shift. He's always said from day one, this is against Hamas, not against the people of Gaza. He knows that when you're in a war, it's very hard to make these distinctions. Urban warfare is the worst form of warfare. The tunnels have added a whole new dimension. He understands that. Most conflicts, like if it's in Mosul, Raqqa, when there's a disaster, you move innocent people out of harm's way into Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan. Here, the fear of some of the Arab countries like Egypt is so profound that Israel wants to kind of put the Palestinian issue on its lap that it's American policy that there's no displacement outside of Gaza. So the people are stuck in a very narrow zone. But the president thinks like Israel should understand that, for humanitarian aid, this will give you more breathing space, not less. He's been more pronounced over time about the lack of a clear plan on the day after. And I think what's really happened is that American policy has been focused on what I call putting all the eggs in one basket, which is a pause for 6 weeks that would get out at least 40 hostages and would enable also a ceasefire, a pause of sorts in Lebanon as it is in Gaza, and perhaps, just perhaps, pivot to something with Saudi Arabia, which is a low probability but high reward given the nature of the electoral calendar in the United States, which maybe we could discuss later. But I think the president would like, the objectives are the same objectives, but how you conduct the war, how you conduct yourself in the war is not probably the way he was hoping. And look, this is a war, let's be clear, like all wars in the Middle East for the most part have been short wars, 6-day war, remember, 6 days, the 73 war, 19 days. Yes, the Intifada of 2000, 2004 was much longer, but it wasn't of this sort of high intensity. And that the nature of a long war is going to bring much more tension into the relationship. Churchill, I think, famously said the only worst things than having allies in wartime is having no allies. So alliance management is not easy in a long war, especially when there's an asymmetry of power. And Britain was kind of the junior partner in World War II, but it's difficult given all the issues that crop up during the war. But I don't think the president has backed away from the three core objectives: bringing the hostages back, toppling Hamas from power, and avoiding a wider regional war, involving Iran, all of its proxies that would suck in the United States.
Right. One additional question before we move on to the second round, David, and that is the U.S.-Israel relationship obviously is central, in large part because Israel is one of the two central actors in this conflict. Has Biden's view of the Netanyahu government and the prime minister changed, do you think?
I think it's evolved. I mean, given all the tough decisions, I think the president feels there's a certain asymmetry in incurring political risk, in wartime. In other words, that he feels he's up against maybe some of the progressive elements of his party and others, and he's incurring risk. He's heckled at every campaign stop. This is an election year where there are a few states that could swing this election, and he's willing to incur this risk for something he believes in deeply. But he feels that in Israel, that the prime minister is not willing to incur the same amount of political risk that he is. And it's tough that this war is happening in an election year. Israel will say, yeah, but at least you have four years. With me on any given Wednesday, there's a no confidence vote and I'm out. But I think that it's clear that there's a fear that because of these coalition constraints, it is constrained the prime minister from, taking more risk when it comes to bringing in humanitarian aid. It has an impact on Rafah, that he's always looking to see what the coalition can bear, what the traffic can bear domestically. And the day after, it's like to him, it's clear you can only beat, you can't beat something with nothing. If Hamas, if you're going to defeat Hamas, you have to come with a more compelling vision. And that gets into nuts and bolts, like who's going to be running northern Gaza. I had just come back from Israel yesterday, and I was struck in my meetings that I feel that Israel has moved quietly, but they don't publicize it, that they understand that Fatah is the really only game in town, apart from Hamas. But they're not willing to say it publicly. And that, I think, taken together, a lot of these things, it's like, we know on the policy you actually agree with us, but the politics don't enable you to express that. And the net effect is you're not shaping public opinion as a leader. So I think there's a certain frustration. There's probably a frustration in Israel too, that, you're not dealing with the fact that in Israel, many of the public doesn't want Israel to do the humanitarian aid because they think it's more of a bargaining chip somehow, that Hamas is hijacking the aid. It gives them more staying power in this war. Israel's got tens of thousands of people, not living in their homes. There's there are complaints on the Israeli side as well. But there are friction points, but I don't think it's led to a rupture. But it's serious. And
let's move on to round two. I'm going to change no surprises here, but talk about the future. I mean, I could sketch out for you a pretty bleak future, even if an Israeli-Hamas negotiation succeeds. The release of 45 hostages for 45 days of quiet, surge of humanitarian assistance, a de-escalation, maybe some Israeli redeployment from concentrated civilian areas, but you're still left with 50 hostages. The trend lines here don't look good. Hamas probably will survive in some form, either as an insurgency or a political force able through co-optation or intimidation to affect whatever governing structure ultimately comes to Gaza. The Palestinian Authority is weak, feckless, autocratic, corrupt. Abbas is in the 19th year of a 4-year term. He has very little credibility anywhere. The Israelis are likely to remain in Gaza in some way, shape, or form until they're satisfied that there can be some security regime. So I want to ask each of you, against the backdrop of all these uncertainties, could each of you sketch out for me, what do you think the elements of a different pathway for Israelis and Palestinians would be? What's absolutely critical? And I want to leave time for some questions, so I'll press in terms of the time factor here. Masoud, could I start with you? What are the elements of a different future for Israelis and Palestinians, or even in the region?
Sure. Can I have 20 seconds just to say two things about what David said before?
20 seconds, absolutely.
Yes. One is for Israel, they feel that there is actually a war with Hezbollah right now going on in Lebanon, and not that it's on and two. And two, about Netanyahu, it's not only that Netanyahu is not willing to incur the risks, he actually benefits from this not rupture but disagreement with Biden. He politically wins from this rupture between the presidents and the regimes. What needs to happen? I want to say that for most Israelis, their objection for a Palestinian state is not an objection to the self-determination of Palestinians, for the fulfillment of self-determination of Palestinians, but deep fear that the Palestinians, writing their own future, meaning canceling the Israeli future. On the other hand, of fear, we have, our commitment to the moral destiny, or the moral, the moral aspirations of the Palestinians. And what is the most important for me is that one day this war will end, and the day after, Palestinians and Israelis will realize that both people still occupy the same land, and we'll have to figure out how both people need to live in the same land. I have to say that personally, and I will say that the vast majority of Israelis are rejecting the possibility of a Palestinian state because of their fear, meaning the fear surpasses the moral concerns, or even the utilitarian what's going to be here on the day after. But at the same time, I will say that even while I struggle with trying to figure out the morality and the fear, navigating both of them, I know that we have to keep on talking about it. I agree with you that the only viable solution that seems to be right now is there are some different terms for it, but a revitalized or renewed Palestinian Authority. We need to also remember that the fact that Hamas was so strengthened is because Netanyahu refused to speak with the Palestinian Authority and to enter a peace process, and therefore he bribed Hamas with money from Qatar to no avail. It will have to be. And there would probably, in the near future, at least, some differentiation between security control or military control over Gaza and civic control. Like there would have to be a different responsibility of the civic life and security life, where Israel would not, I assume, would not give up on security control over Gaza in the near future. Where it is extremely important to make sure that we are not slipping into a reoccupation of Gaza. So that will be something that, just going back to what you said before about no external actor can do something, but this is actually something that I think needs a cooperation of external and internal actors together.
So thank you. Khalil, over to you. The elements of an alternative pathway for Israelis and Palestinians.
Yeah, I think the unfortunate reality is that the future is being shaped today. The policies that Israel has adopted in Gaza is shaping the future and what would look like. I mean, look at Gaza. We have over 1.5 million of people who are displaced. The north of Gaza is completely devastated. I mean, there is no one university left in Gaza and almost no school left. I mean, you're talking about a future where there is no education in Gaza, there is no infrastructure, there is no one hospital function in the north of Gaza. So the future look really, really, really dark to the Palestinians. I mean, there is a serious fear of an actual ethnic cleansing where Palestinians are being pushed and more and more to Egypt. I mean, we're thankful that the Egyptians never really opened or their mind or the wall to Palestinians to leave to Egypt, but more fear that the devastation today, the lack of law and order that Israel is preventing in the north, the emergence of gangs and clans and others will push more and more people to leave, those who want to educate their children, etc. in the future. I think the only hope, if Israel decides to end its occupation, I mean, even the Gaza Strip, we would argue it was occupied before October 7th. Unless Israel decide to go into negotiation with the PLO and into occupation, I think we will repeat the same mistake. I don't even think negotiation is helpful. I think there must be a recognition of Palestinian rights, a recognition of Palestinian state, and then negotiation, not the other way around. Other way around will guarantee you one result: another October 7th, another tragedy, and another war.
Thank you. Joyce, maybe zoom out a bit on an alternative Israeli-Palestinian pathway and the role of key Arab states in that?
No, for sure. I mean, I don't know, Aaron, how you can talk about any day after or any sense of hope with a prime minister in Israel who is not even willing to acknowledge Palestinian statehood. I mean, we are talking about a government where the finance minister goes out and, jokingly says, oh, there is no such thing as Palestinian people. Where do you even start? This is a non-starter for anything, for, an invitation to the White House, for Saudi Israeli normalization. You at least have to have a rational, logical Israeli government that adheres to past agreements. And we are so far from that. We are even far from the day after. When you listen to Prime Minister Netanyahu, there is no inkling that we are any close to a ceasefire. I'd also like to say, the situation in Lebanon is very fragile. And whereas I agree with David that Hezbollah is not interested in waging a full front war against Israel, I'm not sure if the two sides can, prevent each other from a miscalculation. Just today, we've seen 8 people were killed from both sides. And as far as the Gulf states and Israel, I mean, you're seeing the toxicity of this, that nobody, I mean, even countries that signed the Abraham Accords, they're scaling back their investments, their cooperation with Israel. So this is, again, all of it is a reminder to the region about the centrality of the Palestinian question, but it's not a reminder to Benjamin Netanyahu, and therein lies the problem. We are in an election year in the U.S., and I agree with David. I'm not sure how much leverage the White House has. How do you change the equation? I mean, it's the paralysis is there on the political level, and not until we get an Israeli government in place that can actually look a Palestinian partner. And just let me say also one thing: this whole thing about corruption and reforms, Israel has signed peace agreements with many corrupt dictatorships in the region. I mean, is this the problem with Mahmoud Abbas?
It's not the pushback from the region; it's the pushback from Palestinians.
Sure.
In response to external reform won't work. I mean, if American or Israeli fingerprints are going to be on the next set of Palestinian leaders, it's doomed to fail. The Palestinians will have to decide for themselves, and they don't need an extractive, autocratic, nepotistic, corrupt president who's in the 19th year of a 4-year term.
100%, but that's a Palestinian conversation. Exactly. This is not the hurdle to a peace right now. It's a lot of other things. But yeah, I see Khalil hand up. But yeah, in all of this, I mean, this is, again, we need to bring back the conversation, whether if it starts with Saudi, with the UAE, with others, that there has to be an answer to the Palestinian question, whether it's a recognition of statehood, whether it's a UN resolution confirming that, whether it's an international conference that brings all these parties together. This has to be the future conversation. This is the only track that could give us hope. But I don't see it at all with this Israeli government.
Yeah, so. Before we go to David, just one additional comment. It is that you broke the code. The issue is the absence of leadership. You need leaders, but not just on one side. You need leaders who are masters of their politics, not prisoners of their ideologies. Leaders you need a Mandela. You need a Rabin, a King Hussein, a Frederick de Klerk. Leaders who are capable of making decisions beyond their own personal politics and legal travails. At any rate, just an editorial comment, I apologize. David Makovsky, we're nearing the hour. I think we can spend a few more minutes with the questions, but your prescription, your RX for a better pathway for Israelis and Palestinians.
Look, it's, you want some sort of pathway that gives dignity to both sides. If you only give dignity for one side, this will not work. It's not stable. So, I mean, that's my point of departure. I've been always supportive of two states, even though it looks very bleak right now. But I think for the listeners on this program, however they're listening to it or watching it, they need to understand the interplay between, I think, something that we heard from Masua and also from Khalil Joyce is how extremism on each side feeds off each other, how it shapes the political landscape in a way that Americans don't really get. Aaron, I'm quoting you when I've quoted you a number of times when you said, our liquid assets are the Atlantic and the Pacific. It's hard for Americans to really put our heads around this. We really have a hard time because we don't realize there's just, too much history, too little geography. These people live very narrowly, but what's so critical, and that you have to realize that extremism on the Palestinian side impacts extremism on Israel, and the reverse, okay? And the reverse. And so for me, when I wrote a book on Oslo and the decision making in the 90s, and then people said, well, Israel moved to the right, but the right is heterogeneous, and this is a crucial point. Yes, there will always be Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, the ideological right. You'll never convince them because they think it's all about biblical patrimony, that these decisions are not just misguided, but they're illegitimate because of the stakes of biblical patrimony. But most of the people who moved to the right in Israel did so because of what Massoua said, the fear. They fear that, look, if a Palestinian state looked like Costa Rica, every Israeli would sign up for it. Maybe except for that ideological right, but it's a minority. They just want to know one thing. If they withdraw, are they more secure? Or are they more vulnerable? And if diplomats cannot give an answer to that, then you lose Israel. And frankly, we won't have the support. And by the way, on the Palestinian side, if there's settlements that are unbridled, we won't have Palestinians either. And so it's crucial to realize this point. Unless we address people's gut fears, they say, Israel, you got out of Gaza, you got rockets. You got out of Lebanon, you got rockets. So if you don't like the book, you're going to hate the movie in the West Bank. And if we can't address these fears, that withdrawal makes you more vulnerable and not more secure, we can talk about two-state solution for the next 20 years and it won't happen. And by the way, again, I want to say the same on the Palestinian side about settlements. Their fears as well, that there's nothing going to be left to talk about. So we need some pathway that really, Aaron, in my view, that is for dealing with the Israeli fears. It's about security. It's about performance-based. There's security benchmarks. There's clear criteria. And for Palestinians to pretend like, oh, Israel, although you're so strong, it's all irrelevant. It's an excuse. That is a fundamental misunderstanding. And I would say the same to an Israeli audience. If you don't understand that the Palestinians worry that this is a charade, then you don't get them. But there's no shortcuts. I love sports, Aaron, as you know. We've been trying to hit the home run here on this issue. I was part of it. I was in the Obama administration. We tried to hit the home run. You tried to hit the home run in the Clinton administration. Condoleezza Rice tried to hit the home run. And I think these were all noble efforts, truly noble. But what I've learned from all this is that we have to hit some singles and doubles, because we swing for the fences, we strike out. And if we got to deal with the gut fears on both sides, which is about security, to bring back the Israelis to the center where they were before, and also to bring the Palestinians back. I just feel there's no shortcuts. I realize it's not sexy to say what I'm saying, but I feel that we've tried the other way and it just doesn't work. And but we got to keep our eyes on the ball and not be complacent and not say, well, if it's there's no violence, then there's no need to push. And then if there's violence, you say, I can't afford to push for two states. We have to realize it's going to be a long haul, but we have to take clear steps and we have to address people's fears. Thank you.
Thanks. David, thank you. Massoua, thank you. Joyce, Khalil, thank you. I have to say, I participated in a lot of these discussions since October 7th. This one was quite rich. If we had another hour, we could have dug much more deeply on any number of issues. I'd only close with a quote from Jack Kennedy, the first and last president who ever had an emotional impact on me. Kennedy described himself as an idealist without illusion. If I could pick any phrase to describe where I think we all should be, it's idealism without illusion. Never giving up on the prospects that there can be change and a better pathway for Palestinians and Israelis and the region. But as you go through the pursuit of that, after 20 plus years of being out of government, we've got to go through this process with our eyes wide open. And when we fail, usually it's because we see the world the way we want it to be only, not the way it really is. Somewhere in between, that's where competing justices perhaps can be reconciled. I want to thank the panelists. I want to bring back Lily. I'm sorry for those who couldn't ask questions. It was a great discussion. Lily, over to you.
I just wanted to say thank you. This is not a scripted response, but this is the thing I have been looking for all of these months, is such thoughtful conversation with so many voices in one place. I wish that this had been a place where you could have solved all of the world's problems, but really, I think that just being able to hear all of you together and to have so many amazing members of our community here to be part of this conversation tonight is to maybe a single, right? Maybe so. Thank you all, and on behalf of the JCC and on behalf of WGBH, we just want to say thank you to all of you for being here tonight. It means a lot to all of us, and we hope that we will come together again in better times. So thank you, everybody. Have a good night.